but Gail, truly, like, thank you for making time. You have so many places that you could be in the world today, and so much incredible work that you're, empowering within your community and the Black agrarians in Northern California. And I just think that there is such a special joy and humility that you've chosen to spend an hour here with us with the Farmers Footprint community. So thank you so much for that. It is truly
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, awesome. Well, we're gonna rock this amazing conversation. So Gail has prepared a history-rich deep dive a little bit on the quest for land and Black agrarians, movements across the U.S. and their ability to navigate the agricultural space. So very excited for that. And then we'll kind of transition to a question and answer session in the back half of this hour. So definitely be thinking as the conversation rolls along, if there's anything that you want to be asking Gail, if it comes to mind, you can put it in the chat as we go along, or also as a participant, if you go down to what says participants and then click raise hands, you can raise your hands as we're getting closer to the question and answers section. So, and thank you also everyone for being here. I have to say I've been really kind of sitting deeply with just the relational nature of regeneration and how it cannot happen if we're not talking about it. And it cannot happen if we're not sharing our time and minds and hearts with the stories and lives of people who are doing the work on the ground. So you also have a very incredibly important role in this movement. And just by showing up here today, I think there's huge space to commend all of us for just being a part of the conversation and for listening with open hearts and minds. So thank you everyone for being here. All right, cool. So to just give a brief introduction to Gail, she is, wow, you have such a long history of incredible work, Gail, from getting your PhD and focusing within the anthropological spaces, more so than I've seen a lot of farmers move down those academic pathways. That is one thing that has just really impacted me about your work, and I'm really excited to hear more about what inspired you to do your dissertation around supporting Black farmers and learning the history of their work and lives and their definition of regeneration within this space. And then, of course, she has founded Farms to Grow, which is a nonprofit that is supporting and advocating for Black farmers within Northern California. And also you started the Freedom Farmers Market, which created a whole new space for Black farmers to get their foods out and really start to develop that mastery around distribution and supporting this entire ecosystem of farmers that otherwise, it seemed like they were kind of coming up against barriers. So I'd love to just hear more a little bit about that journey, Gail. And yeah, I think I'd love to pass the mic to you and let you take it away.
Okay, I think I can do that. I want to start out by saying thank you, Tori, for moderating this, and Leah and Jesse for writing such an amazing article. I was telling Tori that I can avoid probably more of these sessions by just sending folks directly to that article. It is comprehensive, and it's got a picture of my grandmother in it. So I couldn't be more thrilled. I want to start out today a little different than I usually start out. I usually start out jumping right in to talking about my first interview with a Black farmer. But I want to talk, I want to set the stage for why I chose this title, They Loved to Farm, Black Agrarians' Quest for Land. And I'm going to set the context for post-Civil War. So right after the Civil War, very few Black families had land. There were Black landowners in the North, but in the South, very few landowners. And from the Civil War to about 1910, remarkably, 213,000 Black families became partial or full landowners. Now we know from the census that there were over 920,000 Black land operators, but the predominant share of those were sharecroppers and tenant farmers. I'm not sure if you all know about that history, but it was another oppressive labor system that followed the enslavement, the forced labor camps of the plantation. But so what happened? Why was it so important, this land ownership and land access? You know, today we use some terms, we talk about land access and land sovereignty and land justice. I'd like to consider that the sharecroppers had land access, right? The 213 partial and full land owners, they had some semblance of land sovereignty, but unfortunately neither had land justice. So just put that in the context of how we're talking about and using these terms today: land access, land justice. And I want to put that context of what Black farmers were dealing with. But the quest for land was everything. Historians write about it. Manning Marable, Blazing Game, John Hope Franklin. It was the primary conversation within the Black community. It was what Black folks knew. It was something that was familiar, and it was a talent and a skill that they know how to have sense of independence. So having land was everything. When you had land, you could build a community because your children could stay there. They could marry, husband and wife, get a plot of land, have children near the extended family. Before you know it, we had community enclaves developed. So land, this quest for land, was the quest for freedom, the quest for continued freedom. When I first interviewed a Black farmer, his name was Bill Chambers. He was 89 at the time, and his land he owned in a place called South Adams County, Ohio. Now, throughout our conversations, the one dream, the one thing that Mr. Chambers, although he had raised two families, his one dream was to have the land, the 300 acres that his father had. And that was his dream. He says, I wanted my father's land. There's something that people identify with land, and it is a part of who they see themselves and a part of a community. But you would think that they wouldn't, because even with this man, Mr. Chambers, who upon two occasions had lost his home to fire. When his family was out, and sometimes when they were there were all kinds of attempts, but these two particular times, the white neighbors had literally burned his home to the ground. He was fortunate enough to get some support from the Catholic Relief Society. But he, in spite of all of that, he still wanted to farm. It was who he was. And I say that my first interview with him was surreal. I had not met someone that had lost so much, but was so loving. And so I began to understand this relationship that these farmers had with the land. Yes, it was painful. Yes, they had dealt with discrimination, but it was a way for them, in my seeing, for them to live out how they believed. They believed in the value of nurturing soil. They believed in the value of being a part of a productive community and raising their families as such. Very early, I was very lucky in my career. I worked on my PhD to teach a course. I was invited, I spoke at an anthropology conference, and just so happened that the head of the anthropology and sociology department from Denison College was in the audience. She later contacted me and she says, I love what you're doing. I love what you were saying. Would you be interested in teaching at Denison? I think I was beyond my candidacy, probably doing more research. And I thought, okay, that's nice. But I was already teaching at Ohio State. I was teaching physical anthropology and cultural anthropology. And I thought, I don't want to really teach another intro course. And I asked her, I said, well, what do you want me to teach? She said, whatever you want. And I thought, are you kidding? So I taught my dissertation. I taught all the research. So my course was called Sustainable Community Black Farmers in the US. So I collected these textbooks that I had been using and learning from. Many of the textbooks that I had been were required readings as part of my PhD program, talked about sustainable agriculture and regenerative agriculture. And those practices I saw on the farm. I'm out there on the field with these farmers, and I go back and I'm like, wait a minute, that was a reference to crop rotation. But these farmers were doing more, well beyond sort of those ideas, crop rotation, intercropping. You know, we learned about that. But what they were telling us about was they had, for example, cotton fields, but they were growing watermelons in the middle of the cotton fields. Now, yes, that certainly was from companion sake, but that was mostly for survival's sake. You know, so these farmers had to be so creative and innovative on how they used the land in addition to how they fed themselves. So I learned so much from, you know, taking my students there and you know, learning from the textbooks. But then when we started going to the when I took my students on the farm, we did an overnight field trip with Mr. Chambers. And lo and behold, here was one of the books that I used for my class. It's called African American Gardens and Yards in the Rural South. Believe it or not, they saw these in my dissertation work was in Ohio. They saw those practices. They were, to say the least, very fascinated. And so my explanation as I began to talk about the material culture of Black farmers, why indeed they had to recycle, reuse, because they didn't have a lot of fertilizer, that they had to figure out how to get a good crop on maybe some compromised land, but they did it naturally and holistically. So those, you know, highlighting those particular aspects of the way Black folks farm, and you know, consistent with some of the literature, was very eye-opening. Then I moved to California, and I met a pig farmer named Bill McGill, and he actually farmed in the same ways that the farmers I saw in Ohio, the farmers I saw in Alabama, but he had a pig farm. I'd never seen a pig farm before. And what he did, was a term that we use in anthropology called bricolage, where it's a recycling, it's a reuse, it's an incorporation of everything, material from the farm or from wherever you reuse these things. I saw the most incredible use of bricolage, and I called it landscape architecture, how this pig farmer had very little resources, but everything he had went back to the farm. So I saw these themes throughout my career around the material culture, the gentleness almost, if you will, of how farmers did not disturb the land. And of course, from the very beginning in 1997, when I met Mr. Chambers, he began to talk about the discrimination. That was across the board, nationwide. So it was really fascinating to me how these farmers, in spite of all that they were up against, continued to farm. There's another term that I learned in the literature called Gnosis. It's an African philosophy, and it means you just know. There's a just knowing. And I would often hear the farmers, I would ask them, you know, about different things that they would do, and they would say, you just know. That's a very African way of looking at your world. It's a way of knowing. But that knowing is not just based on, it's a lucky guess. It's actually based on ancestral knowledge that's been passed around, that's been handed down, and either through osmosis or familiarity. These people know, they do the same things that their grandparents did or their parents did. And so they may not remember, which happened to me when I started farming, not really paying too much attention to when I was hanging out with my grandmother who farmed at 8. When I got my farm, when I first started gardening, I dug out a garden in my house. And I put my hands in the soil, and I just started heaping up the soil, farming, doing, you know, what I thought made sense. one of my elder mentors came over and she said to me, she says, look at that. How did you know how to do that? I said, I don't know. I just knew. And as I began to reflect on my grandmother and all the other years of growing food, I am recalled back to that memory of my grandmother, some of the ways in which she planted. And so that knowledge, even though it was peripheral as at the time, it was in me. There was a way that I knew how to garden because I was familiar with that and had been exposed to that through my grandmother. So I saw the consistency of these farmers who are land-based people who had a reverence for land. They had a reverence for the cycles of the moon, which in fact is how they decided when it was time to plant a certain crop, depending on the phase of the moon. Again, this quest for land was all over because it was a sense of independence, a sense of self-sufficiency and identity. It was a sense of safety. There were at one point over 182 all Black enclaves within the US. Tulsa, Oklahoma is one of the most familiar, most famous. But Nicodemus, Kansas, Allensworth, California, these two places are still around. But many of those all Black enclaves met with the same end that Tulsa, Oklahoma did. They were bombed, they were burned, the people were murdered, the people were lynched. People are still trying to tell the stories of some of these towns, but people moved into those enclaves. They bought land. Their relatives were able to build a home and buy land because it was safe, they thought. And so that was another real, longing for land, is for safety. In many ways, there were spiritual relationships, spiritual connections that farmers had to land. Most Black farmers never farmed, as they say, fence post to fence post. They always kept a forest. And the reason for that, in many cases, it was for opportunistic foraging, but it was also to pray. It was also to have a refuge, that people were so immersed and so close to nature that they remember their grandfather, they remember their grandmother going out into the woods for hours. They would go into the woods and pray for hours. That was part of that relationship to nature. So this, and I also want to mention that that sense of ownership had, in some ways, it was conflicting because these were people who were just owned, so to speak. They were property. And in the ways in which the African philosophy in traditional African ways of looking at land, you don't own land, it's family land. You steward the land. So when someone marries, depending on the tribe, they move to that area, or he moves there or she moves there, but it's always accessible to the family. Nobody owns it. But in the US, because of capitalism and the structure of all the ways in which this country was developed extractively, everything is owned. But when I talk to Black farmers, they know the politics of having to own land for the sovereignty piece, but they're more interested in stewarding the land. They feel that you can't own land. And again, that's another very African philosophical way of looking at community. They knew the importance of ownership because they could tell people, you're on my land and get off. But the fact that a person or a family could own something that belongs to nature was very foreign. So let me say a little bit, that's the context I want to have us consider around the importance of Black ownership, the importance of why when Black folks came out of the Civil War, why land was the quintessential element that needed to happen. When we did, fast forward, I did my dissertation, interviewed a lot of farmers, wrote a dissertation about the sustainable agricultural practices of Black farmers in Ohio, but I had interviewed Black farmers in Alabama and Georgia also. One of the things that was so important, what I noticed and what I saw, and it's not by surprise, the intergenerational approach aspect of these communities. Everything was intergenerational. There was a thought of the grand, the great grand, and the future. So these farmers were never in this particular period, one, snapshot. They were in a continuous, ongoing passing of a baton, passing of a knowledge, taking care of the land that had been handed down to them, hard-earned land. From a not going from having no land to making all kinds of sacrifices. We don't even have enough time on this show to cover the ways in which Black community members were able to accumulate 213,000 acres of land. All of the lynchings and the violence and the ways in which they had to stay to keep that land. But they did get that land. But the approach that Black communities use around looking at everything was an intergenerational approach. And so that's how we actually, when we started Farms to Grow, it was really important that we work with farmers who were farming. We remember the history and the legacy of the farmers that had passed on. But our eye was on the future. Our eye was on sprouting the next generation of farmers who could not have anything as a viable career unless we made sure that the farmers that were farming kept their land, which was the exact same approach, the exact same model that I experienced and became familiar with as I, entered these farmers' lives, walking with them, on their land, talking about every aspect of the knowledge that they knew. They got it from a grandparent. They got it from a generation prior to them. And they made real intention around bringing the next generation in. Now, oftentimes, because of the hardships that these farmers had to face, their next generation, their offspring, didn't want it. And for good reason. Many of them wanted their children to go off and get college degrees. And many of them, that's what they did. They left the farm. They went to historically Black colleges and universities. But some of them eventually came back to the land. And in most cases, from the research that I was doing in Ohio, for those offspring, for their siblings, or the offspring that stayed, many of those were the daughters. So the daughters stayed and they married and they kept the farm. They took the farm. I remember a story in Ohio of an all-woman hay baling crew where they got the hay into the barn, all women. And so, it was very fascinating, and there's still parts of it, this experience that's so surreal, a group of people that are so connected to the land and so connected to the community. And it is like there is a sort of if you think of a plant coming out of the ground that's coming straight through the person's body and going straight through their head and connecting to some bulb or some bolt or some light in the universe. They're so connected and they so are in love with this land. And I think it kind of rubbed off on me. I developed very early when I met Mr. Chambers, a passion for telling their stories because they were so invisible. What I saw in my research starting in 97 and 98 was the beginning days of the Pigford versus Glickman litigation. Farmers who had were suing the USDA for years of discrimination. So I know farmers, I was working with Kansas farmers, and they spent all that time going to Washington, away from their land. But there were people that stayed on their land and they didn't go to Washington, and they continued to, believe that the discrimination would end. And, here we are today, 2021, and there's still discrimination. There's still lack of access. I told you the parallel that I see between sharecropping and land access and land ownership and land sovereignty. Black farmers continue to miss land justice. And even as they began to get ownership of land, they were still preyed upon and not given the support that they needed. But they stayed anyway. They love the land, they love farming. I think it's because it's what they know and it's who they are. And so I am here to help support that vision. Our organization, we founded as a way to advocate and support for African American farmers. We are, we were, when I started this work, I could not believe what these farmers were up against. So I spent the first four, the first 4 years probably just being very annoyed and being frustrated, and in many ways just being very pissed off at the fact that these were some of the most loving individuals that I had met, and yet they were dealt with such a crappy hand. And so there was a need. For me, I needed to do something. There needed to be someone that needed to stand in the gap. And so our organization over the last 16 years has been advocating and getting business opportunities, CSA. We're working on commercial opportunities for our farmers, getting Gardens to Grow program where we teach young people gardening, getting them the next generation in the pipeline. I'm working on a documentary right now called Rhythms of the Land. Basically, these are narratives of farmers. These are interviews I did in 2012. They're farmers in their 90s, in their hundreds, and they're talking about what it was like for them. Some of them are sharecroppers, but right now, they were former sharecroppers. But right now, the ones that I interviewed were landowners. And so this particular Black farming story needs to be told. Very low footprint, not a lot of visibility. It's becoming more popular now, but just the many ways in which these Black farmers have continued to try to participate in the U.S. Agricultural landscape and the ways in which they have been up against. I will say the last thing that one of the, I think the complexities of the way that Black folks, Black landowners look at land, because there's such a sense of the commons within an African thought system, communal land. I mentioned, how it is that you can think of ownership. But in the very beginning, when Black farming communities were being built, it was the sense of the commons. It was very communal. We're going to buy some land. We're going to build a church. Then we're going to build a school. But it wasn't for the farmer. It was the farmers that helped these communities get developed. They would get the land and they would allow the community to build a church. The first thing was a church. Then when they got big enough, they would have church they would have school in the church. Then when the community got big enough, they would build a school. But this was land that was given to the communities by the farmers, people who were agrarians. So there was a great, incredible sense of the commons. And I hope that's where we're headed back. I hope we circle back. Tori and I were, talking about some ideas around how coalition support is so important. And we're not going to be able to be the individual, me, Jane Farmer, me, Don Farmer, unless your family's millionaire, you got the whole ag landscape figured out for the next 50 years, there's always going to be something. I mean, now we're dealing with COVID. But again, the larger landowners are the ones that have been doing very well. But if you're a small farmer and a small landowner, there's always going to be something. And in most cases, Black farmers are small landowners. They always have been. So for that idea of the commons, it is essential. And I hope that is the ways in which the next generation, when they come back to land, my dream is that they come back with the commons in mind. I think I'll stop there. And I could say more, but I'll just entertain a few questions or comments at this point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gail. That was what an arc and a picture that you painted in definitely my mind's eye. And
thank you.
So many of us. So yeah, we do have some amazing questions rolling in, and to just frame up as well, I think, the conversation that you and I had and your work really does speak to that that center and gravity of just what is the power of the collective versus the power of the individual, and the relationship between those two that needs to be to be pointed to and spoken about and elevated. So really
and there's
appreciate
that
that.
relationship too. You know, we fail to acknowledge the very personal relationship that we have with the land. I work with young people, and for every young person, they have their own individual relationship with the land. Some of the kids want to push the wheelbarrow, some of them want to shovel the soil, and some want to water. I'm just fascinated by the girls. They always want to water. And you see them taking their very sweet time, like they're having a conversation with the plants. And I think those are the ways in which people underestimate the power of the land and the power of connection. So that's why I think the commons is so key, because we're there together. We are in relationship with each other. We're in a relationship with our food, our community, our family, our God, very spiritual. And of course, you know, we got to eat. So that nourishment, that nurturing comes from a relationship. And that's another, I think, really critical element of the farming way. A farmer doesn't just, you know, he's not out there. Well, the farmers that I've interviewed, he's not out there like, ooh, that's $1, that's 50 cents. Oh, that's $200 over there when they look at their crops. They're not doing that. You know, they're looking at feeding the family, you know, saving seeds, teaching legacies, feeding community. But it's not the commodification of that experience. And that's what happens when you have a relationship. It's less of a commodity and it's more of a relationship, and you take care of it. You make sure that you don't, you know, overforest or overfish. I work with, I have an article in this book. I should have mentioned it, but there's so much. There's an article in here, Land Justice, and I talk about Black agrarianism and how a lot of the traditions around how people conserve the fish, conserve the forest, go back to how they see nature. And I'm not sure if you've heard of the Gullah Geechee community. My folks are actually Gullah Geechee. But this book, it's one of the many books that talk about the people and their African heritage. And one of the things that the Gullah Geechee, which is the last really intact African community in the US, it's been studied the most. A lot of the language is still there, a lot of the practices. As a matter of fact, there was a song that is featured in the film, The Language You Cry In, that was taught. It was taught in Mindi only to girls. That song survived over 200 years because there have been Senegambians coming into South Carolina since the early 1700s. So that song has survived many generations. Well, in the 1980s, there was an ethnomusicologist doing research in the Sea Islands, Georgia, and heard this song sung by a Georgian American woman in Minde. When they went back and they found the community that that song originated in, and it was in Sierra Leone, and they went back, and the family that had been taught that song and continued to teach it only to the girls. It tells you a lot about how women are critical in passing history and the transference of knowledge. But when they're in this community, and one of the elders, he asked, why did she remember that song? Now, the song is a burial song, right? It is a burial song that people sing today in traditional Africa when they take the body to the burial ground, and it's about rice. So they have a meal of rice and they bury the person with the rice. So they asked this elder, he said, well, why would they remember that song? Why would they teach this song? Why would that song survive generations and generations? And the elder says, you know a people by the language they cry in. That was a burial song that had survived generations because the people were still doing rice. Now, they didn't know when they transferred that song of generation to generation that they were singing a burial song. But that just goes to show that people, not even knowing what it meant, knew that it was important to pass it on for generations. So those are the sort of the anthropological, ethnographical instances of people maintaining their relationship beyond, again, the commodity aspects of the land. It had a spiritual, and not only that, it identified them with people they had never known. And so those are the ways in which people value land, and they use land to maintain community.
It was so profound. The invisible ties that keep us also connected. And
yeah, it's a great film. The Language You Cry In, you can get it in the California newsreel. We shared that. We have this would have been our 6th year, but we have a Black Farmer Film Night, and we usually show that and other feature Black films. But it's a remarkable story. And it just is just, a testament to culture, how culture survives over time and space, and even understanding of particular parts of our culture. But we know that it is part of an ancestry that extends far back.
Yeah, I've been that kind of like section of agriculture, and then let's shrink it down. Like, what is the culture piece of agriculture? There's so much richness in that. So thank you for drawing our attention there. Sure. Love it. I'd love to jump to some questions. We have some rolling in, and Jesse or Tiffany or Greg. Maybe Jesse, do you want me to read your question, or would you like to hop in and ask Gail yourself?
Okay, there we go. I'm unmuted. Yeah, I'm happy to ask. I've had the honor of asking Gail any questions, but I'll ask another one. I'm just so compelled by your journey of storytelling. And I'm curious if you ran in your process of storytelling and interviewing farmers, if you ran into farmers that didn't want to share their stories or had some barriers or walls up in sharing their journey, and what you shared with them in terms of why sharing their story is so important.
I have not encountered that. And then again, I think part of it is I learned how to enter into my community. So initially, now I got an applied anthropology degree at Georgia State, and I went into my master's thesis was youth weapon possession, and I used the context and a lot of statistics. But I had a very clear instrument. I had specific questions I wanted to ask, and I went about it. When I went into the field interviewing farmers with my very clear, specific instrument, and I asked a 92-year-old farmer about this, I was not, it was an insinuation in many ways in how they answered the question. So I would ask, say, for example, could you explain to me how you got into farming? And they would say, we would go into, well, let me tell you about Uncle Charlie. And I'm thinking, I did not ask you about Uncle Charlie, right? But in the telling of that story about Uncle Charlie, I got more than I asked for. I got the story of how they got into farming, but I got a lot of other kind of context around the community. And so there were several instances, when I first started going to Mr. Chambers, I didn't ask a lot of questions initially. And I learned they asked more questions of me. So where are your folk? Where are you from? What you doing? Who are you? What are you doing here? And so I had to be really transparent. I had to be upfront. I had to be as vulnerable as I could be. And because I was able to do that, I got some intricacies. I got into the hearts and soul, in some cases, tears with these farmers, walking in the field, sitting in a barn, talking about a lost relative, or talking about, livestock or something. So it was like I became family. I always took stuff home. I always gave stuff. I always came with something. And so it was a whole different kind of experience. I think that's when I left, when I would leave those interviews feeling like I cannot learn all of this. They've opened their hearts to me. They've told me of their losses, what their disappointments are. And I'm going to go and get a nice doctor, PhD somewhere with a nice plaque on my office. And, that just didn't feel right for me. So what I wanted to do, because they shared so much with me, I wanted to give so much back. And I guess that's what I've been doing since 2002. It's almost 20 years. Been trying to give back a little bit of what they've given me, an understanding. I didn't go to Ohio State to interview Black farmers. I went to the Ohio State to go to Ecuador. I was supposed to go to interview an Ecuadorian community of Shota people, Africans who had been marooned. And in the 60s, they just started coming into the women, coming into the village and trading. And so I was with a group of researchers, and they said, Gail, go get the PhD and come on back. And it was the very first conversation I had with my advisor in '97, when we were talking about his work with Amish farmers, and the topic of Black farmers came up, and I didn't know anything about it. I left his office and went straight to the library. There was the first information for me that talked about the discrimination. And that's when I was, again, I was like, what is this? Is this really happening? They're talking about being discriminated by the United States Department of Agriculture. I wanted to know more. And the more I found out, the angrier I got. And I thought, this has got to stop. So, I figured that there was something that I could do. We didn't know what we were going to do. We started Farms to Grow in September 13th of 2004. And we just knew something needed to be done. I had gotten really just, the last piece of frustration hearing about a Black farmer losing their land or not being able to get into a market or something. And so, I got into this work to try to do something. And so that's what I've been doing for that length of time.
Thanks, Jesse. Really wonderful question. Gail, I love how you weave. You just took us from storytelling to like ethos. Like you're living a calling. It's not just a vocation, and it's so clear from your words. Yeah.
I think the farmers have rubbed off. I totally believe that your life is a representation of who you are. You don't have to, you can speak it, you live it, and that's what I saw. My grandmother, I grew up, as I said, I grew up in Daytona Beach, and I went to the beach a lot, and she had a garden and she had chickens, and all of her friends had, fruit trees, and they had something, in their yard growing. And I just thought that's what everybody did. I kind of took it for granted. And then growing up and going out in the world and realizing, no, that's not what we all do. And then when I ended up going to finding farmers, or I almost say farmers found me, I realized that I had that love of putting my hand in the soil like my grandmother did. And it really reconnected me to her. She passed, I think, in '87. And when I built my garden, I felt like I was at one with my grandmother. And every time I put in a garden, it's totally different. Put in a seed, that whole relationship is so profound to me.
There's healing there, to be sure.
It's very healing. It's very spiritual. I want to share it with everybody. That's one of the reasons that I'm doing this film. When I first interviewed Mr. Chambers and we went walking on his farm, we were in his barn, I saw his film. I saw sharing his story, the visual pieces of it, with the world. And I didn't, kind of left me, and then, graduated and you go out in the world. And then it was in 2012 after, because I maintained a relationship with a lot of the farmers that I met throughout my life. I still do. And they would always update me, so-and-so farmer, Farmer Bill, he passed away this week. Farmer Lillian, she's gone on to be with the ancestors. And it was my goal to interview the eldest of the farmers, because those were the ones that I thought could make the connection to the next generation, that intergenerational piece. So this story was, again, about that intergenerational story, that work of bringing our elders, circling back, and then reaching forward to share these stories with the next generation. And I've been seeing this vision, since '97, since I interviewed Mr. Chambers. I'm very thankful that I get to tell this story. And I when you do a lot of self-awareness like I do, I realized, you might have heard me just say sort of short of mouth that the farmers chose me. I sincerely believe that. It was, since I've been on this journey, it has been a spiritual journey for me, as I have learned the lives and the ways in which these farmers have loved. It has been very transformative. I've always been someone that appreciated nature, and I grew up on the beach. It was really important to take care of the beach. But the holistic way in which I experienced the way Black farmers go about their business, I had never seen that in the sort of general population, if you will. It was so important that they talk about the next generation. It was so important that they respect the prior generation. Who are these people? You know what I mean? It's like they're reverence for everything. They can tell you if something is going on, if there are fewer bees this season than last season. They can tell you what's happening if they don't see the rabbits. Oh, that must be that GMO corn that they've gotten into. I mean, they just know, right? Which was one of the reasons that I came upon the title of the film, Rhythms of the Land, because they seem to have a particular understanding of the rhythms of life. First of all, planting by the size of the moon. They're leveraging everything that's a part of our natural environment to grow crops. How did they know? I don't know. It's in the almanac. Who was the first person that said you plant your potatoes on a half moon or a quarter moon? But they knew that. They passed that down. It's the paying attention to the nuances of your environment, because your grandfather walked that plot of land. He shows you the part that doesn't get good drainage, so don't plant anything over there. Maybe that's a good place to do something else, right? They knew the times and the ways in which, depending on the weather and the climate, there were certain things that you had to, rotate out or rotate in. And those just nuances of knowing come from being on the land, come from having a relationship with the land. Did I see?
So true. Yeah. No, I mean, it's just, thank you. So beautiful. I want to jump to downstream Danette for a quick question.
Sure.
But first, can you tell us what you were cooking? Because that looked really good.
I'm always cooking. Yeah, it was actually I had some leftover sushi rice, and so I turned it into a pudding with eggs and currants and tangelo rind, and a lot of little odds and ends.
Sounds great.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you so much for being here, everybody. Tori, for putting it together, and just it's been lovely to hear everything so far. And My question has to do with having been born here in this country as a person of European descent. Like my mother came here, born and raised in France, but came here because my dad was a Vietnam vet and he was traveling around the world. And so I just kind of feel like I happened to be born in this country, but I've never felt quite like I belonged here, because it seemed like there were more important things that had gone on. And like, I feel like my liberation that I've worked towards in my life for the sake of my kids and communities and everything is very much woven with liberation of all the people who have had their lives in this place. And I've found that that movement happen with it. I don't know what to call it. It's like I it's like a sense or a download or some kind of, like I'll be able to like move forward after being like meditating a lot and just getting information that allows, because I basically I just feel like
Is she cutting up a little bit for you guys too?
Did you freeze up?
Yeah, I think, oh no. I was so excited to see where that was going.
Oh, we missed your question. Please.
Oh, sorry.
It just cut out a little bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if you could repeat your question, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so I guess I don't know what you heard, but essentially I feel very much like my my ability to be present for myself and for my family is tied to other people's ability to be present for their children and their families, and that in this country we have such a wild mixture of liberation, and that like I have not felt like I feel like I can only get so far in my own personal liberation without having this sense that I'm working with people who are also doing that, and that I could never, having been a person who whose people came from somewhere else and did a bunch of shit to the people who were already here, that I feel like is completely heinous, you know. And then off of slavery piece, bringing people from a whole other country, there's all these things I wrestle with every day with being myself in this country, and it's made me feel kind of landless in a sense. And I feel like I've been to Europe plenty of times because my family is there, and when I go there I don't have that feeling. It's a very distinct difference. And so but I'm born and raised here, so it's like, you know, a thing I'm working towards. And so I'm always looking for ways to, in my business and in my life in general, to tie my livelihood into the livelihoods of Native peoples and Black people, and Black and brown people, just people from everywhere who are kind of in a similar situation maybe than that I am in, except for maybe have a little bit more of a lot more of a discrimination against because of the way that they look and because of the way our culture or lack of culture functions or doesn't function. I don't know. And so I guess specifically I wonder to ask you, Gail, what your experience of also of Native, Indigenous sovereignty, food sovereignty, what kinds of organizations you know of, are working with, that are also because obviously those movements, those food movements intersect with what you've been speaking of so far, which is you know, the history around Black farmers and in this country. And I wonder, because I don't hear much about it. I don't hear much about Native peoples, Indigenous peoples from this, because what's there, like 500 and some odd different ones. And I even being a person who pays attention to that, I don't hear very much about it. And so I'm interested to know what you know about that.
And that's probably by design. But there are some great, are you in the Bay Area by any chance?
I'm actually in Arizona, which is a place there are,
You're probably in a good place. There are several First Nations efforts that are going on right now in the Bay Area. There is the Segura Te Land Cooperative, where they're getting rematriation, they're getting land back. Some of it's being given to them, thank goodness. But all over the country, from Washington, Arizona, to New York. I know that there is the Land Trust group out of New York, but First Nations people are doing the same thing. They are getting, most of the land. So the government owns about 60% of the land. I think about state governments and First Nations people own the rest. And then there is about maybe 1 point, private land owned by ranchers and forest, million acres. I can't remember the statistic right now, but there is what's happening with an ecosystem right now within the movement of land sovereignty and agroecology is that the coalitions are being built. I was just on a panel through the Berkeley Food Institute. We were talking about the various coalitions that are urban ag, First Nations. I was the moderator, so I talked about the work that we're doing that's being done within the Black community. But yeah, there are efforts, and I'm not surprised that you don't hear of them. That they're there. But I would look up Segura Te Land Cooperative. That's one that I know in particular. What's also being so wonderful about what's happening with the First Nations peoples, of course, their seeds were taken, their language was taken. So they are now, I was on a panel, and when the kids come from school on the bus, they're hearing Navajo language. A lot in some groups I know about in the Bay Area, the American Indian Council have an after-school program where they're teaching young people to garden. They're bringing back some of their native corns and beans and different crops. So, but to your point about sort of the emotional attachment, it's just imperative that we're part of an ecosystem. We can't be isolated, even those that are in positions of privilege and power. That particular isolation from the larger indigenous communities, the larger communities of color, that's not healthy. It's not going to take us to the next frontier, right? So, a lot more effort, I think. There are efforts right now to bring these groups together. As a matter of fact, if you're I keep going back to the Bay Area, the Gill Tract, which is some land in Berkeley, they actually have ceremony. They allow that land to be used for First Nations people with ceremony, but they bring the whole community. They have, volunteer days. And so, there's certain areas I think that are exemplary, like the Bay Area. But I think it's certainly, I know it's got to be happening in Arizona, because I know that there are a lot of rematriation efforts around seeds. I don't know, I can't think of the community in particular, but yeah, those are very, very real emotions. And certainly I appreciate you for acknowledging that and your question.
Thank you. Beautiful answer. Yeah, I think to your piece too, Gail, you've been steeped in Northern California, and there's so much wisdom to just slowly, the more that you're in those spaces, you start to meet and learn and develop trust with those groups who are doing that work. So
yeah,
Danette, I think there's definitely space to research. Thank you for that beautiful question. Yeah. I know we're at about time, but if you have time, Gail, I'd love to maybe ask just one more question to you, and then we can
go right ahead.
Wrap up. Okay, cool. Well, I'd love to, Greg and Leah, I don't know if you'd like to ask your question directly, or I can read it for you, whatever feels good.
Yeah. Hey, really similar, obviously, or honestly, to the last question, but it's more about land access and how we can steward land that either we don't necessarily have, like either we buy it, or what are the ways we can steward land through either land trusts or co-ops, or what other ways can we do that for generations, not just short term, or maybe not just buying it, but how can we do long-term stewardship for multiple generations?
Yeah, that is a partnership. Land trusts are ways to do that. They're not perfect, but I think a lot of it just revolves around intention, revolves around community saying we're going to do this. And some things have been done before. I always say there's nothing new under the sun, but there are all kinds of innovative ways now that we can take a model, tweak it, and make it relevant to the times. I would, certainly the land trust, the notion of the commons, which there are ways in which communities can come together. There's a community here in Atlanta. I think 12 or 16 families purchased 98 acres, and they're building a community. So it really takes the thought around it, the intention. There are several models, and I don't think there's one model that fits all, but if they are all about, I think, addressing issues around power and equity, and all the ways in which we must attend to dealing with the planet, sustainably, with the future in mind and an eye to the legacy that we're a part of. I could see limitless ways in which communities can be together. I think one of the ways, and it may be really uncomfortable for some people, is that some of that land, and this is what the demands are in particular for First Nations people and for African Americans that lost land in the South, is a reparations, and to redistribute that land that was taken, and especially if it's land that's not being farmed. And that's going to get a little bit uncomfortable, but there's really no other way to kind of balance that scenario. And I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but we've got to look at more of that. There's a group in Oakland called Planning Justice, and they've actually given the Agoria Te, I want to say a quarter of an acre, a half of an acre of land, and they want to figure out how to rematriate other pieces of the land. There's a group in New York that's doing the same thing. The community that was native to that particular plot of land, they're figuring out how to give it back. Yeah. I mean, that's just the best case scenario, but that's one of them.
So gorgeous. Yeah, thank you so much, Gail. Amazing. I'd love to, I know it is fun. I'd love to, I think we can just kind of put an amazing bow on this conversation, and I'd love to invite you to share any final thoughts or words that, or a message kind of that you'd love to leave this group with.
Just, right now it's a big push for, I guess, equity for Black, Indigenous farmers of color and people of color in general. And I think it's a time to be a part of an ecosystem that really celebrates the legacy of people on land, and celebrates the ways in which people identify with land, and to be a part of a very active and action-oriented agenda to make sure that there's balance within our communities, that everybody has access to land, especially people who want to farm. It's tough. If you want to farm, go at it. We want you to help you, and especially going to take care of it. But that is, the issues around, land sovereignty, and I don't see any way, we throw this idea around land justice, but until people who have had access and lost it, and people who want access and don't have it, until they can get it, then there's not a lot of justice in that. So keep an eye on that justice piece.
Yeah, that land justice especially, that's a newer term to me, and I think a nuance that I think is important to distinct and become aware of. So Gorgeous. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
your time today. This was
It's been fun
amazing.
being
I see
hanging out
smiles.
with each one of you. So stay in touch.
Awesome. Yeah, we're very grateful for your time. And again, everyone, I just put some links in the chat. You can donate to Gail's film project, Rhythms
Yes,
of the
we
Land
still
at
have our
GoFundMe.
GoFundMe campaign, and we'd love to have your support and share it with your network.
And then follow along with her work on social. I'm sure we'll be getting updates on the film, and just so excited and appreciative to learn more from you today. You're a wealth of information.
Thank you.
And
Well, I thank you all for
historical
your
passion.
support and the visibility.
All right, y'all. Well, thank you so much for coming. We will see you again soon in another Farmside chat or in Mighty Networks before then.
Bye-bye.